one that made every party fun. Every moment funnier. My dad was raised on a farm. I know he was a little farm boy. He knew how to work with his hands. He was raised working with his hands, and he never stopped. There's not someone that worked more or harder than him. He really loved his mom. He wasn't like the typical mama's boy where he ran everything next to his mom and made sure that she was okay with every decision. He wasn't like that, but I think he just found her adorable. It was just so important to him. I think my dad was 26 and my mom was 18 when they met. I don't know how my dad felt, but I know my mom didn't like him because my dad had a sense of humor that was sometimes hard to understand. He asked her if she wanted to go on a horse ride. She said sure. And I think from then it just kind of fell. After 6 months, they got married and had my big sister, and then my other sister, then my other sister, and then me. So my dad, who came from 4 boys, 2 girls, and my mom, who came from a family of 4 boys, 2 girls, had 4 girls. It was probably a good thing. He was so rough. I don't know what he would have done with a little boy. My dad, when I was little, he wasn't around. He worked a lot. There was a time period where we had decided to move to a different area and build a home. During that time, my dad was not around. He was working, and then if he wasn't working, he was at our house working on that, which was an hour and a half away from where his work was and from where we were currently living. Even after our house finally got done, he worked a job where every Monday night, that was like the night that us girls could sleep in our mom's bed because dad wasn't gonna be home. I think that kind of wore on him, and my mom started to work to help out. They would wake up at 6 o'clock, 5 even, and leave and go to work and then not get back till like 5. Although my dad didn't have to work on Saturdays and Sundays, he did. He was outside all day long. He never stopped working. I remember like, man, this guy, he's just a workaholic. He just does not quit. I never heard my dad complain about how much he worked. And he loved talking about like whatever project he had going on, because my dad loved to master new skills, whether it be raising bees or raising pheasants and quail and checkers. He just always had something, and he didn't quit until he succeeded. My dad was a very rough man. He played rough. He teased. He could come up with the funniest games for us to do all the time. He was always the life of the party, really. We would go to family events, and he was always the clown. And he raised us girls to not be wimpy. He would try to get us to get up and go and help get wood early in the hours of the weekends when we finally could sleep in. Even though he had us come and go with him, we didn't do much helping, but he made us come anyway. He was just bound and determined to get everything done, and he wanted us girls to get stuff done and know how to do it. And he loved it. He loved his chainsaw, he loved his tractor. Like, those things were so special to him that the idea of anyone else using them was too special to him. He was funny because when you got him presents, he always acted like he didn't care. But then you'd see him later on that day playing with his remote control car or whatever it was, and then saying, hey, look what I learned how to do, and showing us whatever trick he learned. My dad outside was always happy. I don't think anyone would have ever known that he wasn't. He showed up wherever he went and was happy, friendly, and sweet to everyone, would talk to anyone and make people feel special and fully acknowledge them. As far as I was aware, my dad was the most confident person I knew, because he wasn't afraid to approach anyone. He'd approach anyone, and even the dick assholes of the world that act like they're better than you when you talk to them, he still approached them, he still talked to him, he still acted like it's fine, and he didn't talk bad about him afterwards either. Where as I'm watching him talk to them, I'm like, I hate those people, they're mean, they're rude, they're judging him. But my dad was the one saying, hi, how are you? Hope you're doing okay. Was always someone that I think tried to play off his emotions. I mean, when I was a little girl, my dad didn't cry. But then as time went on, he got just more and more emotional. I never heard him ever feel dumb. He never talked badly about himself. He never really talked about his pain. I think everyone on the outside, especially when it wasn't in our house, because although my dad was sweet and caring and loved everyone, when you're home, the mask comes off a little bit, and we saw things that no one else would have saw, and we saw a little bit of the hurt, the anger, the upset that he was feeling. We saw that play out, but I didn't really talk about it. But everyone else would never know that about my dad, because he didn't ever let any negative emotion show out to anyone else. He just wanted everyone else to feel good. So I think he held it in. Before my dad met my mom, he just had lots of nieces and nephews. I mean, my dad's the second youngest in his family. Most of my cousins are even older than my oldest sister. So my dad was like the uncle. Whenever I hear stories, I just hear how great he was, how silly he was, how he was one of the kids, basically. I think it was just shortly before he met my mom. My dad had a niece who was playing outside, and she was playing in the front yard. Dad was working at the shop, which is right next to my grandparents' house. Saw her playing outside and yelled at her and said, hey, you need to get inside and go get your coat on, it's cold. And she didn't listen, and I think he told her once or twice that she needed to get inside and go get her coat on. Well, a little while later, there was a crash. This man had crashed into the fence in my grandma and grandpa's property. My grandpa was out there yelling at the guy, and my dad started to panic because where was his niece? He ran around looking for her, and eventually he found her, and she had passed away. My dad went crazy. Growing up, the shop is something that I've always walked past. It's just like a metal shop, and there was dents inside of it that I never really thought twice about. Years later, I found out that that was for my dad that day. I had never really heard about Savannah. When I was a little girl, she started to get brought up a little bit more, but I didn't know who this Savannah was. And whenever Savannah was brought up, just the name, my dad would get emotional. When I really think about like the first time my dad got Booby was when this little girl Savannah's name was brought up. He always grabbed his hat, covered his eyes, and did kind of like a little giggle to hide his cries. She clearly was so important to him. And he missed her. He blamed himself. And eventually, at this point, I'm probably 10 years old, and my aunt, Savannah's mom, asked my dad if she could come over. I wasn't there, but my mom and my sister were with my dad. When my aunt came to visit, she told him, "It's not your fault." And my dad fell apart. My mom and my sister said that was the worst that they've ever seen my dad. He cried and told my aunt, "I know it's not my fault. I know it's not my fault." And then told her, I'm sorry, there's nothing I could do. She was gone. But he told her I wasn't man enough to pick her up. And every day, I think my dad carried that. So this confident man I knew, who could approach anyone, would talk to anyone, who would talk about, hey, yeah, I'm a really great guy. Like, my dad talked very highly of himself. Because he was a good guy. He was the first one. He's the first one there and the last to leave whenever someone needed help. I mean, when you hear stories about like a perfect neighbor, that was my dad. He cared so much about other people, and he wanted other people to feel good, and he worked really hard to do that. My entire life, I saw my dad serving people. And by the time he got home, he would go do things and take care of things. But I think he was exhausted because he did so much and he needed a break. I think ultimately my dad had a lot of things for hurting him inside, and he just never really expressed them. When I was really little, he drank and he'd get really mean. He did that for a couple of years, and then I think he kind of had like a eye-opening of like, okay, I need to stop drinking because it's causing problems. And he stopped for years. He was a perfectionist. He was definitely like, had to go. And everything had to be done his way, or it wasn't perfect enough. Like when we were building his bird cages, he'd have a stand with the poles, holding onto the poles. And then he'd be like, okay, you need to move over this way. And so we'd move over this way. We gotta move over this way now. So we'd move over this way, and then eventually he'd come and move you over. And he was not fun to work with, needless to say. His mind never stopped. So even when we went on vacations, his mind didn't stop. We'd go to St. George every year, and my dad would just be running around the entire time being like, well, I have to do this, well, I have to do this, well, I have to do this. And he'd just be anxious the entire time. But the only time my dad just seemed like he was like good and at peace is when we were on the boat. We'd go to Yuba all the time, and then as I got older, we eventually started going to Lake Powell, and that was like the times that my dad finally just relaxed. Our first time going to Lake Powell, we went in this really cool cove. It was just big enough that we could park our boat into it, and then we pitched a tent. He was clearing it out so everything could fit, and he found a crawdad and went to lick it, and it stuck onto his tongue, and he just, well, this crawdad's just hanging on his tongue. And that same trip, coyotes came, and he like went up to them and started howling at them, and they were growling, and all of us girls are in the tent screaming, Dad, get in, we don't want you to die. Being out on the boat was the time that like my dad just kind of shut off and I let everything go. It seemed like he was his happiest whenever we were on the boat. Any other vacation, he was obnoxious. I mean, he was funny when he would just calm down, but he was anxious a lot of the time. Because again, his mind just never shut off. My dad would work 10-hour days and then come home and work until it was dark. I was really close with my dad. I was close with both my mom and my dad, but especially my dad. Like, we were pretty good old pals, and we were since I was like little. He loved milk duds or as I would call them, milk buds. I loved them because my dad loved them. As a little girl, hating mustard because my dad hated mustard, so I couldn't like it. As I got older, I realized mustard's not near as bad as I thought. And also he bought so much mustard all the time that it's hard to believe that he hated mustard because he brought it home so much. I would watch him and I realized, wow, he makes everyone feel so happy. He's the person that everyone wants at the party. Like, he's the person that if he's not there, like, oh, why isn't Joe here? Oh, that sucks. Because he was just so great. If he could sit down for 5 seconds, we sit and watch movies together. Like, I watched a lot of shows that I probably shouldn't have at the young age that I did because of him. But I was really close with my dad growing up, and especially as a teenager, the older I got, because I always made it clear that if we ever did anything that was wrong, it's okay to come home. You don't need to be so afraid of mom and dad that you can't come home and end up getting in a bigger mess. And I think that made me even more like, okay, well, I'm not gonna do anything bad because I didn't feel like there was something exciting about it. And also, I was raised with drinking on and off in my life and seeing the really ugly side of it. As I got older, my oldest sister was married, my second oldest sister was out on a mission, and my sister above me was married, so I was the only one home, and I loved it. Although I didn't see my dad much unless he was home, we spent a lot of extra time together. I went on dates with my mom and dad a lot. Us three went and did a lot, just us three. When I got my prom dress, like, my dad was the one that picked it out, and it was not a cheap dress, but he saw it and he's like, oh, you should wear this. And it's funny because my dad was always very stingy with money, but when it came to that point in my life, he was very like, it's okay, yeah, let's get this for you, let's do this. From like 16 till I got married, I would almost every night sleep with my mom and dad because I'd get freaked out, and my dad was my protector. But my dad didn't fuss or get angry with the idea of me sleeping in their bed. He was just like, oh, okay, come on. And so I would sleep with them. We were always close. There was a mutual respect, I think, for each other, and a mutual, like, willing to take each other's crap and call each other's crap out and not get offended when we did. If my dad was being rude, I could talk to him and we wouldn't get in a fight. But other people would talk to him and then they might get in a fight. But dad and I had this way of communicating where we just didn't really fight. In my entire life with my dad, he was always working. My dad got in a situation where the career he had chose kind of was starting to basically die because of machines. At first it became just lesser and lesser hours, and then eventually he lost his job, had to file unemployment, and it put my dad in a really, really, really bad place. I was the only one home with my parents, and I knew my dad was sad because he wasn't working, but he was almost gone even more. He started watching movies a little bit more, but he started doing this thing where he'd watch shows and then he'd pause it and then he'd disappear for 15-20 minutes and then he'd come back and start watching. So he just was just all over the place. If he wasn't doing that, he was on the computer searching jobs. Like, he just was always doing something. I think that's when I kind of realized that my dad might have had a problem. That this man that, although he talked good about himself, although whenever he spoke to me, just me, about himself, he had nothing but positive things to say, that maybe he was saying those nice things to convince himself that that was true. Maybe to have someone agree with him, to tell him, yeah, you are great, you are wonderful. I didn't ever feel like he was fishing for compliments. It just felt like it was almost like a cry for help. But eventually my dad finally got an interview for a job that originally wasn't much. He'd be gone 10 days for home, gone 10 days for home. And the 10 days that he was gone weren't always at the same place. He'd be going to different states, mainly in the western states, but he was excited. And I could see how like good he felt finally having a job again. Like working fulfilled his life. Boating and working, that's when my dad seemed like the most happy. He just kept progressing and doing better and making more, got higher and higher and higher up, and he loved it and he was really, really happy. But eventually, working this job, he was surrounded by people that drank heavily and would go after work, go drink, and my dad started to drink again. But I had my son. My dad was the cutest thing. At this point, this was gonna be their third grandchild, and when he found out that my son was gonna be a boy, he was...
You know what, Tommy?
Are you so happy? Are you so happy? Are you happy?
There's no reaction that I love and appreciate more than his. I married a man that reminded me a lot of my dad. Like the most important men in my life, my dad and my uncle Richard, was kind of who my husband was, kind of mixed together. He just wasn't a drinker and didn't have the anger that my dad could have at times. But I knew that as a dad, my husband was probably gonna be pretty similar to my dad, and he is. And so my little boy was roughed housed by his dad, and so my dad had this grandchild that loved being roughed up because he had a dad that was that way, and my dad played with my son so much. They had the cutest little relationship, and I knew my dad loved my son. Honestly, there's not a greater papa. My dad is literally the greatest. It was like the greatest thing watching my dad be a papa, especially to my own child. Like I loved seeing him with my nieces and nephews, but with my child, it was great to see their relationship and to see how excited they got around each other and how much fun they had around each other and the teasing that they did with each other. Unfortunately, but fortunately, my little boy kind of takes after his Papa Joe. My mom was something special to him. He always made it clear, he'd always tell me like, I really love you, but your mom. Or if we'd ever have conversations, he'd just say, you know, you mean a lot to me, but your mom's number one. Like he just always had to make it very clear that my mom was the most important person. And if I'd be like, Dad, I just want you to spend time with me. Why won't you hang out with me? He'd be like, I love you, but I just want to hang out with just your mom. Can you just like go away so I can hang out with your mom alone? Dad was always really good about like, I will help any of my kids out when they need it. But I learned that if I am frustrated with my husband, probably don't say anything to my dad, because my mom could listen and say, oh, you know, but Chad's a really good guy. And my dad would be all on my side and hold on to things that I let go of the next day, but he was still bothered by. But yes, after he got his job, he started to drink heavily again. And at first it was kind of slow. He'd drink every once in a while, but then it got to a point where he'd come home and instantly drink. It got to a point where thing that he used to do when he was depressed and losing his job became a more consistent thing, where he'd watch shows and then get up and walk out and be gone for 30 minutes, then come back and start watching the show again. He slowly started to be harder to be around because he'd be like just a little bit ruder and a little bit more aggressive, or he'd get emotional and he'd say things. We'd have conversations and he'd just say, I'm tired of working like I am. I'm tired of leaving home and missing out on things. He'd get really like booby about it and really emotional, and then he'd say, I just love your mom so much. I'm just so tired of leaving and missing everything and not seeing my grandkids grow up and being around you all. And then he'd disappear and be in his room and be away from everyone. If he was around, he'd kind of be a little at that angry side, or like so obnoxious drunk, and it started to kind of be hard because eventually my dad and the person that I was so close with was slowly like drifting away. Eventually never sober. Because I would come home every weekend. Whenever my dad was home, because he'd be home every other weekend, I would come over for my dad to see my kids. Slowly he started to just not come out of his room. And so I'd be there, but he would see my kids for a second, say hi, hello, and then disappear. I have no pictures of him with my little girl. I have a couple of videos, and I don't even have near the amount of videos I have with him, with my son, that I do my daughter, because he stopped playing. He stopped playing with my son. He stopped making jokes. He just started to sit in his room and watch shows, and pause his show and be outside walking around. Not even doing like little work. I don't even know what he'd be doing, honestly. It was hard. And eventually I said to my husband, I was like December, I said, I feel like I'm losing my dad and we don't have like the relationship we used to. But I would still come over. I'd still have him see my kids. I'd still try for him to see my kids. I'd still try to hang out with him and talk with him. And when we talk, he would talk for a second, and then maybe he'd cry and tell me some things. But I think you're telling me things that you need to get out and you're drunk, but also you're drunk. Can we have a conversation sober? Because I feel like I'm talking to you and then you're not taking anything I said because you're drunk. Started talking less and less. Like I come around more, but I started to not talk with him as much because he wouldn't really talk with me. Easter, we went over and we did an Easter egg hunt. My dad was drunk the entire time, but you know, he was still funny, he was still goofy, he was a little bit more dad, but he still wasn't like my dad, my friend, my buddy. It wasn't the same, but it was like, okay, at least he's like around and playing cornhole and hanging out and kind of being around the kids a little bit. And the little boys wanted to sleep over. The little boys stayed and we all went home. This is the part that I'm like, what do I share and what don't I share? April 13th. That morning around like 10 o'clock, I headed down to go pick up the little boys. It was just like an off day. Saw my dad a little bit, and he was drunk. I was talking to my mom, when she looked exhausted. My mom made my dad some food. I heard him say something to her that wasn't the nicest. And then she came in and I could tell she was upset and on the verge of tears. A little while later, maybe 30 minutes later, my dad comes out and I hear him say an unkind thing to my mom as he walked by, and he was blasted. As usual, if my dad did that, I got mad at him. I said, Dad, like, stop being rude. Like, you need to stop drinking. Like, you're really not a nice guy when you drink. Like, you're rude. And my dad just kind of looked at me like, just stop this drinking, like it's ruining you. You're such a good guy. You're such a good guy, but when you drink, you're just like awful. And we got in a fight. My dad told me he wanted me to leave. I said I'm leaving. You're not gonna see me again. And I went and got the kids, put them in the car, and I had called my uncle because my dad was just in a blaze that I was like, there's something, he's not okay, like something's wrong. This is a level that he's never been at before. I just want him to be here, so I wouldn't leave. Like, truthfully, and I feel awful and I don't want to make my dad look bad, but I just wanted someone to be there to make sure like everything was gonna be okay. My mom was gonna be protected because my dad was at a place I'd never seen my dad before. We didn't fight, we never fought, we never had anger with each other, we didn't talk to each other badly. It just wasn't my dad. Waited, and then when my uncle and he was like, what happened? And I just said, my dad's really bad. He just was being mean to my mom. I got upset with him, and it's obviously it's my fault. I'm left with this thought of like, okay, dad went so far. This is his wake-up call. This is a good thing. Like, I'm glad he went too far because he's gonna change. And although I said like you're not gonna see me again, like I knew that wasn't true. I just wanted him to realize like, dude, you're in the wrong, like you're bad, like you are not okay. And it was wrong, like I shouldn't have said that, and I wish to this day, I would have. I'm just glad. I'm glad I didn't tell my dad. I hated him, but I regret so badly saying like, you're never gonna, because that was not my intention. My intention was, he's gonna clean up. This is his wake-up call. Like everyone talks about a wake-up call, and usually their wake-up calls when they like do the worst thing that they could have, or they really made a bad mistake. And dad kind of did that, so he's gonna change, right? I can't tell my husband about this because he's gonna be really angry. I don't want to tell my sister because I don't want her to be angry at my dad. Like, I have to keep this to myself, but this is gonna be his wake-up call. And he started driving away, and we had a gate, so I had to get out of the car to close the gate. And as I'm getting out of the car, oh, my uncle, he screams at me, Maya, stop, don't go, your dad. Your dad. Those words ring in my ear every day. And I feel like if I just hadn't been there that day, he'd still be here. And I ruined everyone's life. Because my dad is a good guy. And it wasn't my dad that day, and I should have known that. Obviously, my dad had his demons, and when he was drunk, those demons were just enhanced a little bit. The anger that he had towards himself came out more. The sadness he had came out more. And I wish I would have, I don't know. I now look back and go, okay, I think my dad really struggled with himself. He was a good guy, and I wish I would have made that even more clear. There's not a better papa. There's no one that I laughed harder with. There's no one that lit up a room like him. He's gone. I just want him back, and I know I can't. And I can't just let it go. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry.
Mommy, understand. Understand.
Yeah.
Why?
I just miss Papa.
But he will wake up like 6 years.
Yeah. Oh, in 6 years, you think?
Yeah, he will wake up 6 years.
Oh, you're the best, dude. I love you so much.
But I will bring him back, and I will put his heart back, and he can be alive.
Oh, I would love that. Thanks, sweetheart. You're the best.
Yeah.